We are continuing our Bible study, our survey of the Old Testament. We've been through Genesis and Exodus recently, last week in Exodus. And at this point, because he is such an important character, he is introduced in the book of Exodus, we're going to talk about Moses and what I call the Moses progression, just tracking the lessons from Moses' life, and I think it's very interesting and informative. As I said last week, he's one of my favorites. I credit him with the Pentateuch and just what it's meant to me as a believer, the Pentateuch, and the study of it, how it has expanded my mind, and given me so much joy. And so we're going to look a little bit at Moses. So the first thing in the beginning in Exodus chapter 2, we are introduced to Moses as a young man. It says in Exodus chapter 2, verse 11 and 12, Moses saw how hard the Hebrews were forced to work. He saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. Now, so far, that ability to see. Now, he had gotten a golden ticket. He had gone into the Pharaoh's household, which made him one of the, most likely, his upbringing was one of the best that you could find in the ancient world. He would be considered super elite in his wealth, in his education, every advantage that he could have. And yet, for some reason, and we don't really know, it doesn't say explicitly how he knew. He knew that he was Hebrew, and he looked out and saw the difficult time that the Hebrews were having. They had become slaves in Egypt. And if you remember, in Genesis chapter 1, when it describes God in that process, what God was doing. Now, he was creating and he was making things, but it said God was looking. He saw. And so I very much think the ability to look and see the difficulty of the Hebrews is a godlike quality, so a positive, a check mark for Moses. Well, he saw an Egyptian, an individual Egyptian, beating one of his fellow Hebrews. And after looking in all directions, it says, thus and thus. Some translations say to and fro. He looked back and forth to make sure no one was watching. What did he do? Moses came up behind and he killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. What do you think about that? Do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing? Well, now I will point out, first it tells us that he did see the hard place of the Hebrews, and he was moved with compassion. That's a godlike quality. Do you think that God was pleased that the Egyptian was beating a Hebrew?
No.
So you could say that him addressing that was a God-pleasing action. But you can't go there, you can't go to the killing, can you? Can't condone that. Now, what if I told you that the phrase in Hebrew, Moses killed the Egyptian, is Moses struck the Egyptian, and that sentence is almost the exact sentence you find in Exodus 12:9, except instead of it being Moses striking the Egyptian, it says, and God struck the Egyptians. Same phrase. Would that change it at all? In other words, is it wrong for Moses to kill, but it's all right for God to kill the firstborn of the Egyptians? That is the final plague in Exodus 12:29, and God struck the Egyptians. Same sentence, same verb form as Moses struck the Egyptian? Does that nuance it a little bit?
No, I don't think so, because God has the power to give a life and take a life, but we as humans do not have that.
I think I agree with you, Pat. I'm glad you're sticking to your guns. You're being brave. I was trying to bully you a little bit, back you down, but I think you're right. This is a difficult passage, and for thousands of years, people who read the Bible and care and think have struggled with this passage. And this was an important passage in my dissertation, dealing with violence by individuals in the Old Testament. And I wrote a lot about this passage. What we find is it has the very first thing we find out about Moses as a young man is that he's a very passionate young man. Here he is passionate in his love for the Hebrews, and it leads him to kill somebody. And so there are positive qualities we see in here, including the striking the Egyptian. But then there's some clues that there's problems with it too. If it was just Moses saw, and he saw the Egyptian mistreating the Hebrew, and he confronted him, and they got into a fight, and Moses killed him, that might change it a little bit. But clearly, Moses had knowledge. Moses knew that what he was doing was not right. He looked thus and thus. He looked to and fro. And then, if you are doing God's business, why do you hide the body? And so the author has given us clues for both things. That there are positive qualities. This Moses has potential. But it's also telling us there's something not quite right about him. And that's why we're talking about progression. This is the introductory story. And usually in literature, you introduce a person, you begin giving clues from the very beginning. Good writing, you start finding out things immediately. And so we're finding out a lot. This is a very, again, use that word, nuanced character. There's a lot of complexities in Moses. Moses is not just a simple, straightforward person. Goes on in verse 15, not only did he hide the body in the sand, when it came out, the next day he saw two Hebrews arguing, and he went out and he tried to intervene and administrate that, be a peacemaker among the Hebrews. And he said, what are you going to do? You're going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? And he reacted. He fled. Then Pharaoh found out. He fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. All right? And so I tend to think, now this is speculation. This is not scripture, so red flag what I'm about to say is Rex's opinion. But I think, God has a will for what we should do for all people. And I believe Moses was God's man all along, and I believe Moses was supposed to go out to the Egyptian, and he was supposed to say, stop. You do not have the right. This is one of God's special chosen people, and you may not hit him. And then if that Egyptian confronted him back, then it was on. And what happened was man to man, face to face. Then I believe that rather than hiding the evidence and fleeing from danger, Moses was supposed to plant the Hebrew flag and say, okay, Hebrews, rally on the flag. We're leaving this chicken outfit. We're out of here. We're going. And if Pharaoh don't like it, we'll do the same thing to Pharaoh. We'll fight. But Moses didn't. Moses is fleeing his people. I think fleeing his responsibility, trying to flee from the face of God. Do we ever do that? We being human beings. Do we ever try to do what we want to do our passion, and then we try to avoid God? We run from God. We medicate ourselves, try to make ourselves feel better, but we don't do it through prayer. We don't do it through seeking God's face. We flee. from God, hide from God. Flash forward 40 years, he was a shepherd. Now, there's meaning in the shepherding. The Egyptians found shepherding to be some of the lowest, most dirty. You think about jobs that are just unsanitary, dirty, you just can't imagine doing them. That's the way they thought. And so that's important. He went from the cleanest place on earth. I'm sure he wore eye makeup and perfume when he was in the Egyptian palace, and he would have servants do his hair, braid his hair, whatever the fashion was, and he went to a dirty job. Low estate, low spiritual estate. Did not feel close to God. He was hoping that God would just leave him alone the rest of his life. And then one day, he was out with his flock, and there was a bush burning. But it wasn't burning up. Exodus, the next chapter, chapter 3, verse 2, there, the angel of Yahweh, and basically, technically what it says is the messenger of Yahweh, the word angel in Hebrew, malakma, I believe malakma, just means a messenger. Same thing in the New Testament. Angelion is a messenger. The angelion is the message, and an angel is the messenger. Anyway, this is basically when it says the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh. It's a physical presence of God the Father. Appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it did not burn up. In verse 10, God told Moses, now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. Okay? So he had grown up in Pharaoh's palace. You know, the fiction movies say that it was his cousin, that he grew up with Pharaoh. They were roughly the same age. We don't know exactly, don't know how well. But so he had been in the palace, and then he had gone as far from the Egyptian palace as he could as a shepherd out in the mountains, out in the country, incognito. God is calling him back to go and confront his past, to go in his dirty clothes to the Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world, probably. Can you imagine, Taft, if all of a sudden God said, Taft, I want you to go to Washington and talk to Joe Biden for me? What would you say? Yeah, exactly. You'd say, you're God, you know lots of people, send somebody else. Send somebody better fit. And you know, Taft, that's what Moses said too. Moses had the same reaction. Did not want to go. In verse 11, but Moses protested to God, who am I to appear to Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? See, we talked about it in the introductory material about the Egyptians enslaving the Hebrews. The Hebrews were Semites and the Egyptians were not. Egypt, before this time, had been ruled for 150 years by the Hyksos people. They were conquerors who came in and conquered Egypt, and so the Pharaoh was not Egyptian, he was a Hyksos, a Semite. They spoke the same basic language that the Hebrews did. And I said then that it is very likely that Joseph had progressed up to being the ruler of Egypt, the regent, the administrator of Egypt, because they were Hyksos. It seems likely. I don't know that that's true. The Bible doesn't say. But it seems likely. Then, after 150 years, the native Egyptians rebelled against the Hyksos. So can you imagine if somebody had ruled America for 150 years, a foreign country, maybe China, and then all of a sudden we said, we've had enough of this, and we threw them out. and then another there was a group of Asian people, we would be rather distrustful of them. Anyway, I won't go too far out in the weeds with that, but they enslaved, the Hebrews still were Semitic people after they'd been oppressed by Semitic people, so they enslaved them. And this was their workforce. Egypt was starting to build in power. They were starting to do construction projects, build pyramids and monuments everywhere, and they needed a labor force. And so not only is Moses having to deal with his past, confront his past, growing up in the palace, then killing an Egyptian, fleeing, he was going to have to go and tell the most powerful person in the world, with the most powerful military, most advanced military in the world, I'm going to take your workforce and we're going to leave. And so he didn't want to do it. He protested. How did God answer him? How do you think God answered him? I don't want to do it, Lord. Well, God answered, I will be with you. I think that's a defining thing. I think that's a big statement. I think that statement is bigger than just this situation. I think that is one of the definitions. We wonder what it means, I am. When God says, my name is I am, I think part of that is I exist, and thus I am the God that is with you. I think it is a core definition here. Why should you go and face your fears? Why should you go put yourself in personal danger? Why should you face the most powerful person in the world? Because I'm God, and I'm with you. And this is your sign that I am the one who has sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this very mountain. So he was it's called Mount Horeb there. The other name is Mount Sinai, where he saw the burning bush. And so it's going to come full circle. You will worship me on this very mountain. I highlighted that word worship in red because that word is aved. We've talked, I'm sure in times past we've talked about this word, and it means to serve. So when you serve God, it is worship. You will come back. And so it is talking about the ritual, the religious ritual of sacrifice, is serving God like you would serve a meal to somebody. But it is translated, you will worship me on this very mountain. You will perform the sacrifice. So hold that in your mind, that aved, that word aved. We'll come back to it. What is the difference between slavery to something and worshiping something? Is there a difference?
Yeah, slavery is forced and worship is voluntary.
Is it? You think it is?
Worship?
Yeah?
Yeah.
What does Paul call himself to Jesus?
A slave?
A slave. So is he forced?
I guess technically not.
It's an interesting concept, and I think you're right in what you say. There seems to be a voluntary, but is there? Are we, when you submit yourself at salvation to God, to Jesus, and you say, the rest of my life is yours. Now, you may wrestle with that. Your flesh may wrestle with that decision, but are you your own person after that? Are you free to choose to not serve God?
Yes.
And in a manner, yes, but in a manner, no, too. I mean, really, can you choose to not serve God anymore? Can you choose to not be saved?
You can't choose to not be saved.
So what's the difference?
Well, Hebrews 12:1 says, the sin which easily besets us. Everybody's got a favorite sin.
Sure.
Like you say, a flavor of sin.
A favorite flavor, yeah. But it's an interesting question because there's not as big a difference as we initially think there is. I have enslaved myself, you might say, to Sarah. Now, technically, I can make a choice to betray her, but I won't. And even slaves do things against their masters. They run away. So is that not a choice? And so I'm getting to a point, I'm driving at a point. There is a difference between slavery and worship, but it's not as clear cut as we think. Because in Exodus 5:9, Pharaoh said, and this was a situation where they came and they said, the Hebrews are asking for you to lighten their workload a little bit because they can't meet the quota, the brick quota. He kept increasing. And he kept taking away, he'd take away the straw so it was harder to make the bricks. And Pharaoh said in response, it hacked Pharaoh off. And he said, make the work harder for the men so that they keep working and don't pay attention to these lies. They're talking with Moses. Moses is making them rebellious. He's making them lazy. Make them work harder, the Pharaoh says. You know what the word for work there is? It's aved. It is the same word
For worship.
for worship. He said, you will worship me on this mountain. You will aved me. And here Pharaoh is saying, make them aved me more. So what is the difference between slavery and worship? The difference is simply who your master is. You see, I said I'm a slave to Sarah, and you said it's a matter of choice. I choose to stay a slave to Sarah. But when I made that commitment in the marriage ceremony, I became a slave. Now I can run away, but I'm still a slave. You know what I'm saying? A slave can run away. And I think the great difference between slavery and worship, between labor, forced labor, and voluntary labor, if you will, is who your master is. And it is your desire to serve and be a slave. Paul said, I desire to be a doulos, a slave of Christ. James, the brother of Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus, said, I, James, a doulos of Christ, a slave. That's hard. Boy, you ain't going to see me enslaving myself to my brother. But it is a volitional thing, as you said, a will thing, that you choose to serve a master, and thus it's worship. You choose to serve God, which makes it worship, versus you are forced to serve Pharaoh, which makes it slavery. And the difference between the two is an attitude difference. Do you see that? Moses protested. So Moses did not give up. In verse 13, he said, if I go down to the people of Israel and tell them, God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? What should I tell them? We talked about this last week. The name is the character, the essence of a person. And so they said, if we're going to leave all we know, is this God trustworthy? Is this God trustworthy? God replied, I am who I am. Say this to the people, I am has sent me to you. And as I said, I think that is, I am as I exist. And I am the God, because I exist, I am the God who will be with you. Those two things are associated together. I am and the God who dwells among his people. The verb I am in Hebrew is called the Tetragrammaton because it's 4 letters. And those 4 letters, you see, I always put into English as YHWH. Then if you add vowels, which the original Hebrew had no vowels in it, then it would be Yahweh. In German, the Y sound is the J sound. The J sound, which is it is a soft G sound. And there's only J sounds in English and German. We get it from German, the J. And so the name Jack in non-Germanic languages would be Yak, right? It's the same thing in Hebrew. And the W, just like in German, W is the V sound. And so the German pronunciation would be Jehovah. If you ever wondered what's the difference between Yahweh and Jehovah, it's who's speaking. If they're speaking the German pronunciation, they say Jehovah. If they're speaking most likely a more traditional Hebrew speaking, it would be Yahweh. And by convention, we say the Lord. It doesn't say the Lord in the Hebrew text. It says Yahweh. But the convention of the Hebrews was Yahweh's name is so holy we don't say it. So instead they say Adonai, which is just the word the Lord. So anyway, just a little bit. I always thought that was interesting. So Moses doesn't give up, though. God keeps telling him, I'm going to send you. Moses keeps protesting. Moses protested again. What if they won't believe me or listen to me? Verse 10, then Moses said to Yahweh, Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. So he's still fighting. We're a chapter and a half now. Moses has been fighting. Now, let me ask you, Pat, was there anything in the introduction story to warn us about Moses just a little bit about his character? And that, by the introduction story, I'm talking about when he killed the Egyptian. Were there warnings there?
Some anger.
Yeah. He looked thus and thus, so he knew he was doing wrong. He did it anyway. He came up from behind. He hid the body and he fled. And do we see that same, was the author being straight up and giving us that warning? Are we seeing some reluctance in Moses to serve God here? Is he fighting God? Yeah, he is. So it was an appropriate warning, wasn't it? And it's good. We have a tendency, because we love God and it is God's word, to make heroes out of the Bible characters. And I like Moses, and I have sympathy for Moses, but the human authors of the Bible have gone out of their way to let us know that Moses is a human being just like us, and that he struggled with his faith just like you do, and God called him to do stuff just like he does with each of us, and we make excuses. From the very beginning of the story, they're letting us know. And so he says, I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Now, the word slow there, what it technically says, is my lips are kavod, which is the word heavy, and my tongue is kavod, heavy. Now, very interestingly about that word, kavod, heavy, weighty, is the same word as glory in Hebrew. So we give glory to God, we give him weight in our life. We make him heavy, we make him big, tangible. And so there is some wordplay, I think, going on here. Moses, again, we said, what's the difference between slavery and worship? It's an attitude thing. What's the difference between being slow of speech and slow of tongue, heavy of speech and heavy of tongue, and using your tongue and your lips to give God glory? What's the difference? It's an attitude thing, isn't it? It's a willingness to serve God. Moses did not want to serve God here. Moses was reluctant to worship God. Flash forward. Eventually, Moses relents and he goes to serve God. We know the story of the 10 plagues. That is the high point. We're looking here at the high point of Moses' career. When we get to Exodus chapter 17, they camped at Rephidim, but there was no water there. They were out in the desert. And once more, the people complained. I don't know if it was this story, but I know in Numbers 20, they're about to stone him to death. They're about to just full-blown rebel. Then Moses cried out to Yahweh, "What should I do with this people?" Oh yeah, they're ready to stone me. Treason, rebellion. And again, this is right on the heels of the crossing of the Red Sea. This is the high point for Moses' leadership in ministry. Yahweh said to Moses, very specific instructions. Walk out in front of the people. Take your staff, which is a symbol of rulership, leadership, a military symbol, which you used when you struck the water of the Red Sea and it divided. I will stand before you on the rock. I think that's a key phrase. Strike the rock, hit it with the staff, and water will come out. He struck the rock as he was told, water gushed out. So he was complete in his obedience. He followed God's instructions to the letter of the law, and what happened? The people are saved. He was God's instrument. He ministered to them. They are saved. He is the hero in this particular story. Flash forward 40 years later, they have wandered in the wilderness, and these people have whined, and there's been rebellion, and they've had trouble finding water, and it's been a hard 40 years, and he is old and tired. We get to Numbers 20, and a very similar story. The story is intentionally told so we remember back to Exodus 17 and that victory, right? In Kadesh, there was no water for the congregation. So they gathered together against Moses and Aaron, another rebellion. Very similar situation. He goes to God, and Yahweh spoke to Moses saying, take the rod, gather the congregation together. So far, just like the other story, right? But then there's a surprise. God says, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. That's odd. Very similar instructions, except why would God say, speak to the rock and not strike the rock?
I don't know.
It's interesting. It's kind of a conundrum, isn't it? An oddity. Well, think back to creation, all the way back to the creation story. And we have roughly contemporary with the Bible, we have the story, the Enuma Elish. The Bible might have been a little bit before the Enuma Elish. That is the Babylonian creation story. And so the Mesopotamian gods, so we get, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the Spirit of God, and there was darkness, and the Spirit of God hovered above the waters. All right? That is just like the introduction to the Enuma Elish. The god Marduk, the storm god, hovers above the water, and that's where the sea serpent, the Leviathan, Tiamat, was down in the water. And in the Babylonian story, the Marduk, the god, sends down lightning bolts and kills the sea serpent. And they cut his body half in two, and with half the body, Marduk makes the land, and with half the body, he makes the sky. But instead, what happens in the Bible? God spoke, rather than hid. And creation obeyed. And so there's a message, if you want to be like God, Moses, and that's why I say the Moses progression, if you want to be like God, Moses, then you need to speak to the rock rather than strike it. So what's the first thing we found out about Moses, Pat, in the introductory story?
That he had anger, that he had
He had anger, and he was a striker. He would fly off and strike and kill. And so it is very interesting to me, talking about a progression, at the high point of his career, God said to Moses, we're in a kind of a jam here. We need water for the people. I'm going to let you be you. I'm going to let you strike that rock, just like you struck the Egyptian. And I'm going to save the people. I'll let you be you. Then after 40 years, God says, now Moses, it's time, rather than you be you, it's time for you to be like me. And rather than strike the rock, I want you to speak to the rock. Moses' progression. So what did Moses do? Verse 10, Numbers 20, verse 10. Before the rock, Moses spoke. Hey, yeah, good, he's obeying. But he spoke to the assembly rather than to the rock. And he said, hear now, you rebels. Must we bring water out of this rock? Who is he talking about? We.
Him and Aaron.
I think him and God. Is that a problem or is that okay?
That's okay.
You think it's okay for him and God to be doing everything?
I guess.
Do you like to put yourself on equal footing with God?
No.
When we baptized Connor the other day, did you say, me and Jesus bestow salvation upon you, Connor?
Sounds to me like he's talking to the people, because he said, you rebels.
He is talking to the people, but he said, we bring water out of this rock. I just find it interesting. I don't want to make too much out of it because I may be wrong, but I think it's problematic that he's kind of putting himself in the equation. Rather than being a servant of God, when I obey God, God brought the water and saved the people. Here, rather than being obedient and speak to the rock like he was told, he speaks to the people and he accuses them of having the problem. And he said, here I am again, me and God having to rescue you. He may be referring to him and Aaron, but nevertheless, and if he is talking about him and Aaron, he's giving God no credit at all. If he's talking about him and God, he's putting himself on equal footing with God. Him as a necessary agent of God's salvation. Very bad day for Moses. Verse 11, Moses lifted his hand, and rather than speak to the rock, he struck the rock not once but twice. He struck it twice with his rod. Water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. So clearly Moses was disobedient to God, very disobedient to God. What is interesting to me here is the nature of God. When Moses it says, you did not honor me in front of the people. Later he says to Moses, why didn't God just destroy all the Israelites and destroy Moses when he was disobedient?
Because there was chosen people.
Because God loved them, yeah. And I find that the nature of God, even though Moses did a thing that was, Moses is throwing a temper tantrum here. Moses is angry at the people. He's had enough, 40 years of leading these people. I'm sick of them. Here I am again. Rather than glorifying God and being obedient, Moses loses it. So the introductory story said Moses, when he obeys God, God does wonderful things through him. Kind of reminds you of Exodus 17, doesn't it? When he obeyed God and did as God told him, God saved the people. But when he disobeys God, like he did by striking the Egyptian without warning, hiding the body, he dishonors God. But Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to demonstrate my holiness, to sanctify me in front of the people, you will not lead them into the land I'm about to give them. So Moses and Aaron do not get to go into the promised land with the Israelites. So I very much believe that this is a progression. I believe that God worked to bring Moses forward. I think we go all the way back to that beginning speech in the burning bush. What was Moses' excuse for not wanting to go? What was Moses' protest why he couldn't lead?
He couldn't speak.
He said, I'm not a good speaker. I'm a hitter. And so in Exodus 17, God allowed him to hit and rescue the people. But God's intention was to bring Moses forward and to have him be godlike and be a speaker. But Moses, rather than let God change him, got angry at others, and he let that anger override his respect for God's holiness. I think there's a lesson in there. All of us are only as good as we are faithful and disciplined to God. And we don't build credit with God so that we can take some time off from preserving His holiness. I think it's all right there, that there's a progression that God intended for Moses, and Moses refused. So in the end, his refusal to progress to being godlike, in that I mean to being a man who speaks with authority rather than one who has to hit, cost him his trip into the promised land. Any questions or comments about the Moses progression? All right, well, let's say a prayer and be dismissed then.